You have to think in 1862, $30 million extra was a lot of money. Clearly, the military needed these funds. Although recently, Union forces had taken Fort Donelson and the city of Nashville in Tennessee, in Virginia, McClellan's Army of the Potomac was brought down on the peninsula there, and Stonewall Jackson threatened the Shenandoah Valley. The bloody battle at Shiloh, Tennessee on April 6th and 7th, just shortly before Stevens wrote this letter, made Northerners realize that the war in the West was far from over. As Winston Groom wrote in last Sunday's New York Times, Shiloh was, quote, no crushing victory, only unimaginable death. More, and perhaps many more, such confrontations were clearly in store. Funds were desperately needed to support and arm Union troops for a wider and longer war. Here we see Stevens in one of his key roles, guiding the financing of the Civil War. When Stevens spoke on the bill before the House of Representatives, a few weeks after he sent this letter that I just quoted, he said it was difficult to determine the precise number of those in the Union forces, but he did not want to, quote, withhold appropriation for the force actually in service. By voice vote, the House quickly approved Stevens' request for $422 million, which included the extra $30 that he was asking for in the letter I quoted. Stevens' leadership in financing the war was crucial. As Brad has already said, he was named chairman of the Important Ways and Means Committee in July 1861. And while chairing that committee, he oversaw the passing in February 1862 of the Legal Tender Act. This bill authorized the issuance of U.S. Treasury notes, or greenbacks as they were called, issued them as legal tender without gold backing, and this was an unprecedented step in the history of U.S. finance. As was often the case, Stevens showed his mastery of the issue at stake as well as of the legislative process, and that kind of ties in with what you were saying, Brad, about what he learned and how to compromise and make some deals. When he was giving this speech, he emphasized only the advantages that bank notes would bring to the U.S. economy. He was going to tailor his remarks to that specific goal, which was the economic needs of the war. He mentioned the war only in passing. In his typically strong language, he concluded, "If this bill shall pass, I shall hail it as the most auspicious measure of this Congress. If it shall fail, the result will be more deplorable than any disaster which could befall us." The money needed to pursue the war that Stevens so determinedly and ably sought was for one goal: emancipation. For Stevens, freeing the slaves took precedence over all issues, and thus it will be the subject of my talk today. As I trace Stevens' role in bringing about the ending of slavery, I'm going to step backward to the election of Lincoln in 1860. Then, Stevens had enthusiastically supported the election of Abraham Lincoln as bringing an end to the expansion of slavery. And notice we're talking about the expansion of slavery, not the extinction. In a campaign speech at the Cooper Institute in New York City on September 27, 1860, Stevens characterized Lincoln as an, quote, earnest anti-slavery man. He will resist the extension of slavery into any territory now free. Stevens asked his audience to join the triumphal throng who were about to escort a Republican president to the executive mansion of a Republican nation. In fact, Stevens said, "We claim no right to interfere with slavery in the states. But slavery must not expand into the territories." And that election, as I said just a minute ago, was really about the expansion of slavery, and that was as far as the anti-slavery forces felt they could go in 1860. But as state after southern state left the Union in 1860-61, Stevens' views changed. He argued forcefully against any compromise with the South in order to avoid war. In the House on January 29, 1861, he stated, let there be no blood shed until the last moment, but let no cowardly counsels unnerve the people. Now, we well know that bloodshed did begin, and there's another anniversary, exactly 151 years ago today, the firing at Fort Sumter on April 13, 1861. Once the war began, justification for the Civil War was the first issue to come before the shrunken Congress, with 11 southern states now having left the Union. Congress's meeting on July 4th, 1861 was its first since the firing on Fort Sumter. A key question hung in the air, Why was this war being fought? John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, ever the compromiser, on July 19th introduced a resolution in Congress, in the House, that the war's aim was not to defeat the South, and here I'm going to quote, nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights and established institutions of those states. And by established institutions, that was a code word for slavery. Crittenden clearly meant slavery here. The resolution went on. The aim is to preserve the Union with all the dignity, equality, and rights of the several states unimpaired, and that as soon as these objects are accomplished, the war ought to cease. Now, the House overwhelmingly approved Crittenden's resolution several days later, but Stevens abstained. And on August 2nd, he forcefully spoke out against Crittenden and other Unionists when he declared that the aim of the war, quote, is to subdue the rebels. He went on to say that he would rather reduce them, that's the South, to a condition where their whole country is to be repeopled by a band of free men. Although Stevens here indicated that he did not hesitate to foresee the end of slavery in the South, he softened his statement by adding, quote, I do not say that it is time to resort to such means. Stevens even allowed, and this again is part of his speech, that he had spoken more freely, perhaps, than gentlemen within my hearing might think politic, but I have spoken just what I felt. He emphasized that the war would eventually result in a time when, I'm going to quote here, every bondman in the South belonging to a rebel, recollect, I confine it to them, every bondman shall be called upon to aid us in war against their masters and to restore this Union. Nevertheless, we note here that despite Stevens's admitted outspokenness, he still declined in the summer of 1861 to expand the war's aim to the full emancipation of all slaves. He limited abolition only to those slaves owned by those in the Confederacy, that is, every bondman in the South belonging to a rebel. Stevens and other radicals clearly realized that they could not move as quickly toward full emancipation as they would like. As seen in the success of Crittenden's resolution on the war's aim, many of their congressional colleagues still insisted that the war was fought solely to save the Union. A reunion with the seceded states, with slavery intact, remained a distinct possibility. Or, as Crittenden had put it, the Union should be preserved with all the dignity, equality, and rights, and by rights that means rights to own slaves, of the several states unimpaired. But there were ways to move gradually towards full emancipation. In this same session, the radical Republicans saw a confiscation bill as one such opportunity. That bill would permit the federal government to seize any property used in furthering the rebellion. And there's another code word, property, clearly meant slaves. They could seize that property. Rebel slaveholders would forfeit ownership if and when their slaves were forced to take up arms against the United States. On August 3rd, the confiscation bill was supported by a strong majority in the House. And Stevens declared, quote, in time of war, you have the right to confiscate the property of every rebel. This confiscation law was a modest step. As a recent reviewer in the New York Times Book Review observed, those who decried emancipation as an unconstitutional attack on property rights found no objection when it was called confiscation, and Lincoln approved the bill on August 6th. Stevens believed that this war would be prolonged. The North's defeat in the Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, which came as a shock to most in the North, was no surprise to Stevens, who anticipated horrible battles like Shiloh. In a speech on financing the war 3 days after Bull Run, Stevens said, "I believe that the battles which are to be fought are to be desperate and bloody battles, and that they are to be numerous. I believe that many thousand valuable lives will be lost, and that millions of money will be expended. The only question is whether this government is prepared to meet all these perils and to overcome them." Addressing these perils meant, of course, additional taxes. And Stevens believed that in this crisis, Congress would enact the necessary laws, and we've seen, as I reported on the 1862 Legal Tender Act, Congress did go along with Stevens. By the end of 1861, Stevens moved more boldly towards emancipation. In December, he stated that by the law of nations, quote, "it is his right to liberate the slaves of an enemy to weaken his power." He offered a bill for the House to consider that the president, that's Lincoln, be ordered to, quote, "declare free all slaves, who shall leave their masters, or shall aid in quelling this rebellion." Now, this bill reflected a move forward for the Confiscation Act that was passed in the summer. That act limited emancipation only to those slaves forced to fight for the Confederacy. Now, Stevens proposed that all fugitive slaves be free. He gave a major speech in January 1862. He initiated there an argument that he would return to in later months. The war could be shortened if slaves in the Confederacy who were now forced to produce food and munitions for the rebels were freed. Why should white soldiers die for the Union when the important resource of freed slaves was available? He flat out declared, "Universal emancipation must be proclaimed to all." And then, as he had done earlier, he qualified his stance later in the speech and stated, "Remember, this is not a war begun by us for emancipation, but emancipation is a legitimate means to defend against a war forced upon us by bloody rebels." The Confederacy, by seceding and starting the hostilities, had given the North the opportunity to pursue a goal broader than restoring the Union. That was Crittenden's aim. To his colleagues and a wider audience of cautious Unionists, Stevens explained, "You send forth your sons and brothers to shoot and saber and bayonet the insurgents, but you hesitate to break the bonds of their slaves to reach the same end. What puerile inconsistency." Stevens here was pushing his colleagues farther than they wanted to go. Not surprisingly, that bill died in this session of Congress. But there were other ways to get at the abolition of slavery. Stevens paid keen attention to the treatment of slaves by Union generals. He supported General John Fremont's order in Missouri of August 1861 that would free the slaves of rebels there, and criticized Lincoln when the president overruled that act. Stevens complained to his friend Simon Stevens, and that is a friend, not a relative, that the hounds had run down Fremont. Later, when Major General Henry Halleck, Fremont's replacement as commander of the Department in Missouri, later when Halleck ordered fugitive slaves to be returned to their masters, Stevens denounced that decision. He spoke in favor of a motion in the House on December 11, 1861, requesting that Lincoln countermand Halleck's order. Stevens said that this resolution, the one in the House, should be approved for the purpose of affecting our generals everywhere else. Again, in May 1862, another general, David Hunter, who commanded the Department of the South, sought to enlist and arm fugitive slaves. And once again, Lincoln overruled that general. Hunter subsequently sent a letter to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton justifying his authority to enlist and arm fugitive slaves. And on July 2nd, the House debated whether or not Hunter had that authority. Even though Stevens complained that he was out of health this morning, and often he will say, I'm not feeling too well, I'm only going to speak for a few minutes, and then he goes on for another 20 or 30. I guess he kind of got wound up once the adrenaline started moving. And at this time, he managed an extensive speech. He declared that Lincoln was, quote, too easy and amiable, and stated that Lincoln should authorize Hunter's policy. One, here I'm quoting, which had been inaugurated by that gallant, sagacious soldier who now commands our army in South Carolina. I said at the opening of this session, and I repeat it, you will never put down secession unless you take that course. I cannot agree to the policy which is forbidding the employment and liberation of these men. As part of his careful strategy towards eventual emancipation, Stevens generally refrained from publicly voicing strong opposition to Lincoln, at least at this time. And in this case, he did not criticize Lincoln's plan to compensate slave owners who freed their slaves. Lincoln had a plan in 1862, which he had presented to Congress, that was aimed at keeping the slave-owning states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri in the Union. And these people, if they would agree to free their slaves, they would be compensated. Initially, Stevens accepted this premise. And in fact, in January 1862, he even laid out before the House specific amounts totaling $300,000 that would be paid to border states, saying we should not be alarmed at the cost. But when Lincoln's plan came to a House vote on March 11th, Stevens once again abstained. And by September of that year, he openly opposed Lincoln's plan. In a speech to the Lancaster County Republican Convention, he said, I will not go with the president in paying for all the slaves. I did not vote for his resolution. For Stevens and the other radicals, in the Confiscation Act of July 17, 1862, enacted at the close of the 37th Congress, was a major step towards emancipation. That bill freed any slave of any person in insurrection against the United States. It declared that no fugitive slave could be returned to his master. And it stipulated that the president could employ, quote, as many persons of African descent as may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of the rebellion. We see here that Stevens' goal was getting closer to realization. In the same Lancaster speech that I quoted above, he celebrated this indication of progress. The House had approved the Confiscation Act by a vote of 84 to 42. Quote, where a year ago, he said, not 50 could have been found. Here in Lancaster, Stevens also insisted that the Lincoln administration must change its policy toward the slave. I protested against the present policy, not only to the people, but to the face of the president and his cabinet, and on the floor of Congress, told them they were exercising too much lenity at the request of border statesmen, not one of whom, in my judgment, has loyalty in his heart. As this speech indicates, Stevens was becoming more openly critical of Lincoln. And a look at Stevens' correspondence shows that his personal connections to the president were confined mainly to requests for appointments for promotions of colleagues. When we were editing the letters, and if you look in the microfilm edition, you'll see Lincoln, and you'll see there's a whole bunch of letters from Stevens to Lincoln. You say, oh, I really want to know what he was saying to the president. And then you look at him and he'll say, somebody over here in Gettysburg needs a job. Could you give him a job? And so they're just not very exciting. And so we had to actually put in the index, I can't remember exactly how we did it, but we put proceeding or recommendation or something so people wouldn't get all excited and think that we had not included in our book edition some really pertinent letters that would reveal Stevens' relationship to Lincoln, but they're just not very many. During the first half of 1862, Stevens lamented Lincoln's delay in emancipating the slaves and considered the president weak and indecisive. In April, Stevens had written Dr. Joseph Gibbons, and there's another Lancastrian, that his hope for the administrations were poor as, quote, Lincoln is nobody. Publicly, Stevens implicitly showed his disappointment with Lincoln by comparing him to Andrew Jackson. For example, in a House speech in January 1862, he had lamented, oh, for 6 months resurrection in the flesh of stern old Jackson. Give him power and he would handle this rebellion with iron gloves. He would abolish slavery as the cause and support of the insurrection. Now, if you just think about it a minute, you realize that Stevens' rhetoric had obviously carried him away. For surely his audience knew that Jackson had been a slave owner. He was from Tennessee. He owned slaves. As the war dragged on through the summer of 1862, with little or no Northern military success, Stevens became even more convinced that a firm stand from the Lincoln administration on emancipation was necessary to rally the North behind the war. He wrote to Simon Stevens on September 5th. It is plain that nothing approaching the present policy will subdue the rebels. He looked for a policy that would treat this, that is, the war, as a radical revolution and remodel our institutions. And here we can see a preview of Stevens' Reconstruction policy. Stevens was not impressed with Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, officially issued on January 1st, 1863. For sardonic, Stevens was less than enthusiastic about this edict, which freed all the slaves in states now in rebellion, but not those in the border states. In a speech to the Union League of Lancaster in April 1863, Stevens stated that partial emancipation cannot be effective. The Proclamation of Freedom, he said, and it is charitably called, although indicative of a sound heart, does not reach the evil. It exempts from its operations every place where it could be enforced. We've seen here Stevens' doubts about Lincoln's resolve. He worried about the appeasement policy of Americans fighting alongside their fellow white soldiers. Stevens introduced a bill which blacks would receive, quote, the same rations, clothing, and equipments as other volunteers. Stevens' bill would also update the provision in the Confiscation Act, allowing only $7 a month to black soldiers, while white soldiers received $13 a month. Stevens knew that many of his colleagues opposed the enlistment of African Americans. And to reassure them, he stated that no black would command white troops. He concluded, I do not expect to live to see the day when in this Christian land merit shall counterbalance the crime of color. Stevens' bill did not succeed. Neither body of Congress agreed to equal pay at that session. A year later, as the House once again debated the equal pay issue, Stevens asked his fellow congressmen, why should the black troops not be all paid alike? Why should they not all charge the rebels alike and die in defense of the Union? And on April 30th, 1864, the House supported the Senate and authorized the equal treatment that Stevens and others had sought. Finally, As territory held by the Confederates shrank, discussion over the fate of the slaves at war's end increased. The time became ripe for moving from exhortation and incremental legislative steps to major legislative act. It was time to propose that slavery be officially abolished. Stevens was not the first to introduce in Congress what became the 13th Amendment. Ohio Congressman James Ashley did so in December 1863, and he was followed in January 1864 by Senator John Henderson of Missouri. Stevens offered his resolution on March 28, 1864. And the straightforward language in his proposal was similar to the amendment that ultimately became part of the Constitution. Both of them are surprisingly brief. I think you think of all that went on to get this 13th Amendment, and then you look at it and you see what a simply worded amendment it is. So I'm going to read both of them so you can see how similar they are. First is the 13th Amendment that's in our Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's the 13th Amendment. Now we see how similar is the language of Stevens. Slavery and involuntary servitude, except for the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, is forever prohibited in the United States and all its territories. Very simple. Now, the Senate moved relatively promptly to enact that amendment in May 1864. The House debated it, but failed to obtain the necessary 2/3 vote before the session ended. Stevens addressed this failure at the County Union Convention in Lancaster in September 1864. Looking ahead to the upcoming presidential election, he warned against a possible victory of the Peace Democrats, including presidential candidate George McClellan. He said every Republican voted in favor of the measure, that's the 13th Amendment. Every vote against it came from the Peace-McClellan copperheads. They are responsible for the continued misery and bloodshed with which this nation shall endure. As the issue of Lincoln's re-election neared, Stevens faced a dilemma, since from his letter to Sumner in October 1863, he had said he hoped that Lincoln's reign shall not be prolonged. And as late as in July 1864, we find him still criticizing the president. This outburst came over the Wade-Davis bill, settling conditions for returning states. Indeed, states like Louisiana were already being considered for readmission. The Wade-Davis bill would require all returning states to abolish slavery and forbid Confederate supporters from holding office. While Lincoln did not veto the bill, he declined to sign it, allowing it to go forward without his explicit approval. About this so-called pocket veto, Stevens explained to his friend Edward Pearson, quote, how little the rights of war and law of nations our president knows. But what are we to do? Condemn privately and applaud publicly? That's on July 10th. Soon, Stevens was willing to applaud publicly when Democrats nominated Peace Democrat George McClellan on August 31st. The Democrats' platform vowed to end the war as soon as possible with the preservation of all states' rights unimpaired, and there's that word unimpaired again, which again is the code word for slavery. Reacting to this threat of the Peace Democrats, which would jeopardize emancipation, Stevens joined his fellow Republicans to support Lincoln in that presidential election. In his Lancaster speech in September, and I know you keep thinking, did I find just the Lancaster speeches because it's a Lancaster audience? But it's amazing how many of the important statements he made were statements that he made at various political meetings here in Lancaster. Anyway, here's another Lancaster speech. He declared, elect McClellan and the republic has ceased to exist. On its ruins will spring up numerous petty empires, whose future condition will be one of perpetual wars and of grinding slavery. Re-elect the calm statesman who now presides over the nation, and he will lead you to an honorable peace and to permanent liberty. When Lincoln was re-elected with a 55% majority, carrying Pennsylvania by nearly 20,000 votes and Lancaster County by 6,000, the permanent liberty that Stevens spoke of seemed at hand. In Lincoln's annual message of December 1864, he recommended that the House follow the Senate and pass the 13th Amendment. Speaking on the President's message on January 5th, Stevens praised Lincoln. Never had a man to decide so important a question under such difficulties. In January, the House took up the debate on the 13th Amendment, and Stevens delivered a major speech, The Abolition of Slavery, on January 13th. He spoke of his lifelong hatred of this infernal institution, the point that you were making, Greg, and the fact that for 40 years he had never hesitated to express these ideas and sentiments denouncing slavery. But here's an interesting twist. Pragmatic Stevens now cleverly resorted to legal argument to convince his colleagues that the amendment was constitutional. Asking the clerk to read Article 5 from the Constitution on Congress's power to amend that document, he stated, "We are not now inquiring whether we have jurisdiction over slavery. We are inquiring whether the states have granted to us the power of amendment," which of course Article 5 did. And on January 31st, the House, by a vote of 119 to only 56, with 8 abstaining, sent the constitutional amendment to the states for ratification. Once all the slaves in the rebel and border states alike were emancipated, what did Stevens believe should be done for them? During Reconstruction, and that's a whole other story, Stevens worked for equal economic rights for the freed slaves, introducing in September 1865, another Lancaster speech, his plan to confiscate the assets of former rebels. Give, if you please, he said, 40 acres to each male freedman. Not surprisingly, Stevens argued for establishing civil rights. As we all know, as Brad has emphasized at the close of his talk, he was the chief author of the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and all its accompanying rights to any resident of the U.S. And we heard Brad give us Stevens' words as that amendment was being passed in the House. As we have seen, has been emphasized earlier, Stevens cared deeply about all suppressed people. This Stevens statement of 1865 beautifully reflects his view. He said, "This is not a white man's government. This is man's government, the government of all men alike. Equal rights to all the privileges of the government is innate in every immortal being, no matter what the shape or color of the tabernacle which it inhabits." Excuse me, there's a big difference. Inhabits. In his fine biography of Stevens, the late Hans Tribut's relates a story which is quite possibly spurious, but it's the way I'd like to end my talk today. Apparently, in the summer of 1862, Lincoln was complaining how Stevens and Senators Sumner and Henry Wilson of Massachusetts were continually pressing him about some kind of emancipation, and that these radicals pressed the president that part is certainly true. As Lincoln spoke with another senator, he looked out the window to see Stevens, Sumner, and Wilson approach the White House. In typical fashion, Lincoln resorted to a story ending in the punchline, "Here comes them same damn fellows again." Thank you. As I said, I think there's plenty of time for questions. I hope you have some.
I have one quick one. Now, you talked about the second Confiscation Act,
Yeah.
which freed slaves even if they weren't taking up arms against their against the Union.
Yeah.
Was that basically the first Emancipation Proclamation, and the Emancipation Proclamation that came after that was more symbolic? Or how important was that to actually freeing the slaves? In other words, did that act actually free the slaves, and then the Emancipation Proclamation just sort of came on as an afterthought?
Well, part of it is that the emphasis in the confiscation is on the fugitive slaves, the ones who were leaving. And, you know, they were kind of avoiding confronting them for a while, said only if they're taking up arms, they can do it, and so forth. And then the second one really did address the fugitive slaves. And it didn't really pay much attention to the border states, and of course that was Lincoln's fear. He didn't want to lose those border states, so he was always holding back because he didn't want to lose Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. There was always the fear that if, this is Lincoln's plans, if he came down too hard on all slaves, then
Okay. But even with the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves had to get away from their masters. In other words, to be free.
And it's very symbolic. It sounds great. And of course, all of the slaves that he freed were the ones that, as Stevens said, they couldn't touch because they were in the Confederacy. So there's no way. And they're only in the land where the Union had taken over, they didn't have, he couldn't free those slaves.
So the Second Confiscation Act, if you were an enterprising slave and you escaped, you were free.
That was it, yeah. But
Okay.
if you didn't flee, you were still under your master. You were still.
But even under the Emancipation Proclamation, you were still a slave.
Well, that's
if you
because
did.
he said only those in rebellion.
Right.
And those were the ones in the Confederacy. So it's a lot of sort of delicate maneuvering going along here. And it's a slow and hard fight. Yeah.
Was the ratification of the 13th Amendment only done by the northern states? Because I guess the others hadn't been readmitted.
Yeah, and that's
right?
how it happened so quickly. Because they wanted to get that
Before the
passed
others were
before
readmitted.
the others came in, although, and I'd have to go back and look. I think that part of the conditions for returning states was that they had to
Ratify.
well, first of all, they had demolished their slaves. So in effect, they were doing that. But no, they got that ratified very quickly. And as a matter of fact, Sumner, who was Stevens' counterpart in the Senate, was against an amendment. He wanted to pass a congressional act to free the slaves because he said an amendment might take too long and get all these states to ratify it. And, you know, we've had a long, prolonged thing, and some of them don't even pass. So he wanted an act, and then, but fortunately, it got into the Constitution, and that's, of course, very important symbolically, is that it's there. It's Article 15. Yeah. Go ahead. There's two of you. This lady here in front of you.
Where did the South get their money to finance the war? I mean, because they weren't as organized as, the administration, and they could
Yeah.
tax. So how did the South gather all this money to fight back?
Well, that's a very good question. I am not an expert on the Confederate financing. I suppose there are a lot of course, people who were very enthusiastic about the separation and the secession. I do know that they got foreign aid. I just finished, or last fall, read a very interesting book on the British attitude towards the Civil War. And it's quite interesting how many British people supported the South and probably did get the money. I couldn't tell you, how much or anything, but there was a lot of.
Yet they freed the slaves before we did.
Yeah, they did. But
Yeah,
they
oh
still
yeah,
supported it.
way before, which is kind of interesting that they supported the South. One thing that is just, and I've studied this for years and years, but only recently have I come across the fact that there was so much blood being shed, and everybody was just horrified. I mean, you read now about Syria and how everybody's so upset about the violence there, and some people just wanted to end this violence, and we don't care. We just got to quit killing each other. And so then there were people like Stevens who said, we got to go through this bloodshed. This is what we have to do to get. But you can see how people would get horribly upset by this kind of bloodshed. And it was really bothering the British a lot. And they kept saying, how can these people, they're both the same country, and just be slaughtering each other? More news came through of battles like Shiloh, which were just awful. I mean, just dreadful casualties. Now, Gail, you have a question.
I have two that sort of go in different directions, so I'll start with the first one. Stevens takes the position that the South has to be readmitted as their individual states, as opposed to an argument that really says, wait a minute, we have come together as a country of separate states, and I, as a state, have the right to leave, okay? So how does, I know it projects a little further than you talked to, because it starts to go to Reconstruction, but would there not, Stevens winds up taking a line that seems to be a logical one if you want to make sure that the rights of the recently freed slaves are secured as full Americans, okay? Was he standing alone in that? I mean, the argument and his loss to history in, what is it, the election of 1870, and not 1870, next one, the one after that, where basically Reconstruction gets deconstructed.
76, the
76.
election case. Of course, Stevens long dead by that time.
He's long dead, but the importance that he laid out becomes the complete change that eventually evolves into Jim Crow and all of that in the South. What else is going on around Stevens? You've laid a very careful argument that he couldn't move as quickly as he would like, that he was understanding, to use Brad's ending argument, he was learning to understand compromise. Where does that go next? Because it seems like he really re-entrenches against a South that should be allowed back in with full rights. How do you see that playing out?
There was, of course, this extreme animosity, and he did, occasionally, there's this phrase that goes in lots of his speeches, conquer territories. And he would say it's a conquer territory. And so I can't answer you specifically, because I think probably he would have gone a lot farther and said that they should be territories. And of course, they did divide the South up into 5 military districts while Johnson was president. And the Congress was unable to do that. There are several Reconstruction Acts, and one of them was these military districts, which is kind of what Stevens wanted. Then you get people like Montgomery Blair, who said they should come back in, they're states, we want to preserve the Union, and there's a tension going on there. And again, I guess I would just say Stevens realized that eventually they should become states. And of course, that's what happened, and most of it happened after he was gone. I don't think I really answered your question.
No, you
But
give me some direction.
He did believe and had this conquer territory theme going through a lot of his Reconstruction speeches. And even earlier during while the war was going on.
That's an interesting phrase I haven't caught going through.
Yeah.
All right,
yeah,
as
yeah.
powerfully, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
You might want to talk about something that I find very interesting. The first proposal for a 13th Amendment, which was made in 1860, known as the Cowen Amendment. You're familiar with that?
No.
Oh, you're not?
No.
Well, that was where the Congress was so frantic to keep the South in the Union that they were bending over backwards on various things to try to keep them in the Union. And they actually passed an amendment to the Constitution which prohibited any amendment to the Constitution about slavery. And it actually passed the House and then the Senate and was approved by Ohio and Maryland before it was dropped. So the original 13th Amendment was an amendment to enshrine slavery.
Prevented exactly what happened, yeah. I'm surprised it got that far, really.
Yeah, well, it just goes to show how much the North was so anxious to keep the South, and it was only because the South was psycho that they withdrew.
Yeah, and then I think that Crittenden resolution reflects a lot of thinking at the time. horrifying to think of the Union being separated, that will go to any extent to have them back in. And so wanted to have that made that one of the policies.
To answer this one woman's question
Yeah.
about the South and
Yeah.
the funds, there was a very interesting PBS documentary on the blockade that was used against the South by the Northern ships,
Yeah.
and how they had to get their goods to Europe
Mm-hmm.
to help finance the Southern, and the
Southern
way that
yeah.
blockade was not that effective.
Mhm.
And they were using various percentages as to how many Southern ships were able to get their goods over to Europe. I mean, I think from Europe's standpoint, they were more interested in the trade
Oh,
than
yeah.
they were about
Sure.
the slavery.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, they wanted the trade from the South.
Sure. And that's, of course, a big thing, the cotton trade, and how the Brits, particularly in northern England, suffered because of the cotton that they weren't getting, and the manufacturing plants were shut down, or workers were put out, and they used that as a ploy. So, yeah, there's another source of money. Thank you very much.
When did the South develop their own currency? And
Oh, I think right away.
right away? And that was recognized, I guess, by the Europeans?
I would suspect so. I mean, you know, there was always the big debate in Britain, and of course the Northerners followed so carefully, were the British going to recognize the Confederacy? And they came very close. They proclaimed the Neutrality Act, which said we will not interfere on either side. And everybody was just thought, well, that's one step, and the next step is we're going to recognize the Confederacy. And there was just awful fear of that, because then that was going to establish the Confederacy in the whole national and international scene, and give them the legitimacy that they sought. So they were always afraid of that. And Sumner, particularly Stevens, didn't have many ties to the British, but Sumner was always working against that. He was so afraid that the British would recognize it.
Historians aren't supposed to say what if, but I would love to hear your opinion, or Brad's opinion, or Ross, anybody's
Yeah.
opinion. What would America look like today if Stevens was the monarch and Reconstruction was put in exactly the way he wanted it to be? What would America have evolved into today, or in the 20th century, in terms of racial segregation, patterns of living, economics, all that? I just love to hear other people's viewpoints about that.
Well, Gil has already mentioned Jim Crow. I think, you know, the whole, I don't know, are you going to show some of the Birth of a Nation?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, well, you get a good taste of some of that attitude. But, yeah, I mean, you think how long and how slowly we've moved towards equal rights. I mean, you know, and you don't know whether the people would have followed him. He was so far ahead of his time that he would just have been one of these radicals that people weren't they're gonna say, oh, there goes Thaddeus Stevens, on them off again, or whether he actually could have led the country. I don't know. Let's hear from some of the others.
Randy, my answer to your question would be that I think what Stevens was advocating was so far beyond what the rest of the nation would accept that it was just never going to happen. I think the nation was really tired of war, and I think the stuff down the South's throat, what Stevens wanted, would have taken harsh military suppression throughout the South. And I think that the guerrilla warfare that we actually got, which was called the Ku Klux Klan, would have been magnified many times had those harsh practices occurred. I think it would. I don't think what he was advocating ever had a possibility of that.
Well-
Sort of, as you say, a man ahead of his time.
Yeah.
I-
Ahead of where the country was.
I would partially agree with these things. I think that it makes, I think the big thing is if Lincoln had lived, it would have been different, because I think it would have been a united North to try to transform the South. probably Thaddeus Stevens wouldn't have gotten everything he wanted during Reconstruction, but I think it would have been a lot closer to what he wanted. I think the fact that Andrew Johnson came in and was like a big supporter of the South kind of gave the South a lot of determination to resist. And I think that was terrible. And I think that really worked against Reconstruction. But on the other hand, you are trying to transform a culture of hundreds of years of people being owned, and maybe just anthropologically, you can't do that. But on the other hand, if you look at something like the occupation of Nazi Germany, how they were able to basically transform this country that had basically bought into the extermination of a race. And now it's, considered one of the great nations of the world where they welcome refugees. So I would like to think that it could have happened if Lincoln had continued to live.
This gentleman wanted to say
Yeah,
something.
well, how soon after his death did the president pull the troops out of the South? Because that's when,
That was 76,
76, yeah,
1876.
that's when it really started
That's
falling
when the
apart.
troops left.
Yes.
And there was a lot of violence during Grant's administration and massacres and so forth, but there was still a military force there.
And just to follow up on what Ross said, the aspect here that neither war nor legislation could deal with was the fact that even those who advocated for abolition did not always believe that Americans of African descent were equal.
That's right.
And putting the laws in place took us 100 years before we started to effectively use them towards civil rights. So if we look back to Europe, we see in England their own civil war. We see how that destroyed a country at that time. You see the ongoing rebelliousness of the Commonwealth in England and the Royalists, a fear here in this country for the imposition of what Stevens wanted. But here you have Stevens, who is much more understanding, again, ahead of his time. You have edited the Lucretia Mott papers. My understanding is that she submitted, along with other women, an application to Stevens to introduce, for consideration of legislation, a universal suffrage bill shortly before he died in 1868. And he was willing to put it forward, bringing all women, all Americans of African descent, I believe Indians were included, that he believed fully in the rights of all human beings. And the rest of society just was not with him on that.
Yeah.
So you want to say something here?
Yes. Regarding what your thoughts might be on if there was truly a redistribution of Stevens of the redistributions of the assets given to those who were enslaved, what do you think the economic commerce how would it be reflected today? That we had people that had ownership and developed the vested interest, how it would progress to where we're at today.
Yeah, well, he of course hoped that if you did this the 40 acres and a mule sort of thing,
Right.
that would bring things along. But I think I'm sort of inclined to agree with Brad that he was way, and I think what Ross is saying too, but I think I'm a little more where you are, that it just was way, way too far for it to happen.
Yeah, the whites would have stolen it back.
And the South, some people are saying the South, there's been books written about how the South has really redeemed its image. And there's a very interesting book out by David Blight who talks about the images and how, and it's very interesting last year, right before the Fort Sumter, how a lot of rhetoric in the South was they were trying to say slavery was not the cause of the war, but states' rights was. And they were succeeding. There's many articles and editorials written about this and people arguing that slavery that wasn't the cause. And so they're still trying to make it look not quite so bad.
I would just like to point out that not only would the South, the whites have stolen the property, the 40 acres and the mule back, but the estimate from the end of the Civil War until 1915 was that in the South, more than 100,000 African Americans were hung in that time period.
It was war.
It was guerrilla warfare.
What time period?
From 1865 to 1915, more than 100,000 African Americans were hung in the South. It was guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, but there was some in the north too.
Yeah,
We're trying to get
there
rid
were.
of the
There
lynch
were.
laws.
Especially, I read, yeah, you're right. I've read some of those books.
I have a question in regard to listening to the logic that Thaddeus Stevens had to put out that no matter what color or gender you were, that you had some equal status, to the point that he came up with the idea of the 40 acres and a mule. How effective was that idea put out so that the slaves could have that opportunity to be able to live and be able to survive
Right.
during that era?
Right, that's kind of what Alex was saying, is could that have worked? And I think both Brad and I are saying it would have been very hard to bring it back.
Some places you hear that 40 acres and a mule, but you hear that plus $50. Was that the fact, or was that just something that somebody just threw in there?
Well, actually, I think that the actual legislation that Thaddeus Stevens sponsored said 40 acres and $100, basically to buy equipment to farm it. So he never said mule. That was actually sort of, I believe, Sherman first brought that forth when he distributed confiscated land to the slaves during the war, and that term 40 acres and a mule came from him, and then Thaddeus Stevens brought in his legislation. So, but I mean, you can't legislate a mule. Well, he could say 40 acres. I mean, that's specific, but he couldn't say mule in his legislation.
Well, thank you all for
Thank
your
you
good
very
comments
much.
and your good questions.
Yes, there's a buffet lunch out here. All the plates are on the far table, but the food's spread around on the other tables.